we have to talk about the relationship of the outer hips and the inner knees. Most of you know this, but those of you who have learned Padmasana in the last 11 months or haven't hung out in Ann Arbor at the Shallow much, this is super important. So, as you know from early in your training, the inner knees can be one of the more high-risk areas during your process of learning the primary series. And this is because there's a little piece of cartilage inside of the knee called the medial meniscus that can come under pressure if we try to move into deep external rotation combined with flexion of the knee too soon in the practice. And one of the reasons that this is high risk is that most of us, if we've spent much time in chairs prior to learning the practice, arrive with a significant amount of tension out here in the outer hips. So trying to come into deep external rotation of that joint and bending of this joint while there's tension out here translates to tension right in here. It's not good. So the piece that we've been touching on in the Wednesday class about integrating the awareness of the outer hips with awareness of the psoas is part of this. And it's the reason that the modifications that I'm seeing pop up for sort of Mrmattmccarthy B and D, generally I don't teach those. I know they're sort of out there in Ashtanga land, but I think it kind of voids the hidden issue of the outer hips and how opening it has a key role in learning deep external rotation. And maybe, though it totally doesn't matter if you ever do this posture, Padmasana or the lotus position. So here's how this works. Let's take, for example, Mrmattmccarthy B. So if there's latent tension out here in the outer hips, sometimes because the left knee might start talking to you and you want to avoid any extra pressure in the left knee, you might take this modification. I've heard it's in Ashtanga books and whatever. I've never read any of the Ashtanga books, so I can't really comment on that. But this approach to Mrmattmccarthy B is safe, and so excellent. I don't want to, especially during these times, encourage you to do anything that places extra pressure on the inner knees. So this is definitely safe, but it doesn't really achieve the opening of the outer hip that is required by the Mrmattmccarthy series. It also doesn't give you the stimulation of the ascending colon that typically happens when there's some sort of lotus position, which may in fact not be possible if you have pain in here. But as a long-term modification of the posture, this kind of shows you how both the opening of the hip to free the knee and the massaging of the GI tract are just avoided here. You're kind of making the outer shape, and it's great that you're sort of addressing some of the internal and external rotations of the shoulders, but the really deep stuff is not happening. In my teaching practice, mostly what I'll do is have somebody start to approach a little deeper work in the outer hips at this phase by spending some time here. So it doesn't look as much like a Mrmattmccarthy B, but we're starting to address that tension that almost all of us have early in the practice in the outer hips that is so necessary to let go of before you start moving into sort of deeper flexion of those joints, right? Same goes for Mrmattmccarthy D. So here we go. The sort of outline of the posture can be approached by not going into the half lotus if there's any kind of danger here, right? But instead sort of folding this in and coming around like this. But again, usually what happens in a shape like this, one, the colon, again, is not being palpated like you would if you were in an actual half lotus position. But two, very often what's going on here, I can't say, in COVID times, but in a shala, when I'm able to be more in touch with a hip joint is that this will actually be subtly getting tighter during the process of this modification, which is kind of the last thing that you want to happen from the perspective of the purpose of the Marichasanas, which you know is to study variations on the theme of the squat and to actually massage your GI tract, right? So all of the variations that naturally come up in this pose, for me, are all good as long as you don't have knee pain. The main thing is not to do harm. But the second thing after that is really to understand the underlying purpose of this series, and it is cleansing the digestion, going into deep squats, and in the long run, that is going to evolve, bringing awareness and integration to this tissue out here. So that said, once Marichasana D sort of makes sense in your system, a lot of people start finding that the full Padmasana is available. Depends on a lot of different joint rotational factors. This can even start to happen for you before Marichasana D. So I've been told by so many different students over the years that there seems to be a particular energy around the Padmasana and a real desire to do it, even if there's some bit of counterindication. It seems like, this is playing with fire a little bit, these postures that have a little bit of sort of ego stickiness to them. And it's so beautifully ironic that we would have this shadow of attraction to doing that posture when it's maybe not 100% right for our bodies, because it's also the posture that supposedly represents enlightenment, right? I just find that like a beautiful irony. And if you are experiencing that, some sort of interest in doing that posture when you're not 100% sure it's right for you, you're not alone. There's some human thing going on with that. So especially during the winter and especially during COVID, when it comes to Padmasana, especially if it feels amazing when you first get in there and you can really find that grounding and centering that it gives to you, but afterwards there's a little ache, particularly in your top left knee, that's an indication that maybe your outer hips or some other part of the joint rotation is not fully ready to spend much time in the Padmasana. So I would check in, are Marichasana C and D actually comfortable and safe for you? And if they're not, there might be an underlying reason to wait on the Padmasana. So if Padmasana is spacious for you and there's no sense of pain in the knee, there's a really important thing that I must communicate to you as you're exploring it now. And if we do this in the Shala, it's a wonderful opportunity to talk about joint rotation, and many of you have been through that with me, but if you haven't, here's the deal. Padmasana, so you're looking at me sort of face to face here, right? So I'm going to start with my right hip joint. This is coming into deep external rotation. My right gluteus, piriformis, all that tissue is sort of softening to allow me to externally rotate that joint. Then there's further external rotation in the muscles of the lower leg, right? So this is going this way. I usually teach people to actually really use the hands and palpate and move everything this way. And then secondarily do the same thing here, which creates an extra little bit of space here around the inner knee, right? So then with those two joint rotations understood, we place the right foot in half lotus, okay? So here's the important thing. Many of us go through a phase during the hip opening journey when we could move into the half lotus or into the full lotus, and it'll feel good once we're there, but we cannot get there without doing this one little move that I strongly, strongly caution you against. And it's this. I'm going to come in and I'm going to actually misuse the posture right now as a way to illustrate what not to do. So you're here, you come in, watch what happens in the angle of that joint, and you lift this up, putting a tremendous amount of torque on that joint, and then you bring the leg in. So did you see what happened there? All this is comfortable, but there's still some residual stuff that I haven't fully worked through out here. And so I'm gonna just kind of move myself around it instead of going through it. I'm gonna lift up the leg, putting torque on that inner left knee, and then come into the posture. And that left knee is still kind of floating, right? You see that? That might work for today. It won't work for next year. It won't work for your 80-year-old body. I really, really recommend waiting if that's the phase that you're at. Keep practicing, and that hip joint, both hip joints, the rotation will come. You just need a little bit more time. When it's ready, here's how you'll know. So that right leg will be sort of established in its rotations. And instead of going up with the knee, I'm going to go out with the knee. So it creates this wonderful sort of situation. Many of you have learned this from me, this kind of cradling of the foot. This is standard Iyengar method. I've not seen it taught in Ashtanga method, but you know, they're brother and sister methods. This is actually really good technology. So what we do is, instead of trying to get the leg into position by going up with the knee, we go out with the knee. Yes, out, which enables you to move in this lateral manner and cradle the leg into position. You see how that works? So it's an out, a cradling, and a down. Never a hauling up and over. So what that does is it keeps that knee joint in a position where it can stay basically closed. You want to keep the knee joint closed as you're moving it around. And it also prevents you from putting torque on the joint. So it's kind of working against its natural structure. Think about that. That torque on the joint is basically one of these if you're trying to move into the position too early in your practice, right? So this is just this little graceful cradle of the leg up. And then you set it down without much bearing on the joint. That said, over time, there is still a slight asymmetry on the top knee joint in your Padmasana, even if you move into it super carefully. So if you're having random left knee discomfort in your practice, this is something to keep an eye on. There may be some aspect of your hips that just aren't quite ready for you to be in the lotus position, even though at all other points in the practice, you feel comfortable. It's just that the setup with the right leg in first means that that left knee is always going to be a little bit ungrounded in this posture. All right, that is the outer hips, external rotation, and your knee joints in Marichyasana, and the posture that arises pretty naturally from it, Padmasana.